Basically, right now, it has been over 7 months since the US has imposed a fuel blockade on Cuba. It was formally imposed on Cuba by the United States at the end of January with an executive order, which essentially threatens sanctions against any country that would sell fuel to Cuba. And at the point that these sanctions were threatened against Cuba, already so few nations were even willing to do that. At that point, it was Venezuela, it was Mexico, and it was Russia. Um, and and this executive order was imposed at the end of January, but already, because the US had been occupying the Caribbean with over 15,000 troops, multiple warships, and other military assets. It had effectively um, imposed a naval blockade on Venezuela and prevented Venezuela from sending any shipments of fuel to Cuba. And we know that several fuel tankers were actually stopped in the Caribbean, um, on their way to Cuba from Venezuela.
Very important topic. And that is where you were last week. Zoe, you went to Cuba. Uh, you were on the
Yes.
ground for, I think, a little over a week. Obviously, the situation there, we've been covering it on the show. The US is strangling Cuba. It's one thing for us to talk about it, to report on the numbers, which is bad enough. Tell us what it's like to be on the ground in Cuba right now under this horrific, escalating blockade, starvation. I don't know what to call it by the Trump administration.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to start by saying something that Arab repeatedly said is that the international community is to blame for so much of this, and the fact that the horrors are allowed to continue in Gaza, in the West Bank, in the Israeli dungeons, where over 10,000 Palestinians have been kidnapped and held and tortured and subjected to unspeakable crimes. While everyone just looks by and does not even do the most minimum action of sanctioning a government is, I mean, right now, I mean, it's different, but what's happening in Cuba is a silent genocide perpetrated by the US government, and it is only able to continue because the entire world is too afraid of the United States to intervene. Because the way, I mean, yeah, so now I'll start talking about the time in Cuba, but it just really that really resonated with me because it's like what's happening right now in Cuba is entirely preventable, and it is entirely manufactured by the United States, but upheld um by the entire world because basically there I am.
I see you. I
uh
see you.
um Basically right now it has been over 7 months since the US has imposed a fuel blockade on Cuba. It was formally imposed on Cuba by the United States at the end of January with an executive order, which essentially threatens sanctions against any country that would sell fuel to Cuba. And at the point that these sanctions were threatened against Cuba, already so few nations were even willing to do that. At that point, it was Venezuela, it was Mexico, and it was Russia. Um, and and this executive order was imposed at the end of January, but already, because the US had been occupying the Caribbean with over 15,000 troops, multiple warships, and other military assets. It had effectively um, imposed a naval blockade on Venezuela and prevented Venezuela from sending any shipments of fuel to Cuba. And we know that several fuel tankers were actually stopped in the Caribbean, um, on their way to Cuba from Venezuela. So this has been, again, in place now for 7 months. And I think, again, we've spoken about what the fuel blockade is. We've spoken about this executive order, the fact that no major fuel shipments have been sent to Cuba except the one shipment from Russia at the end of March. But in reality, this means, again, the electrical grid on the island does not function. And so I think it's interesting, like in back in May and June, we would see these news about like national blackout in Cuba, national blackout lasting 48 hours. And so when I would see that news, I was under the assumption that like there was power other parts of the day. Where I was staying in Cuba for over a week in the neighborhood of Vedado, there was power maybe for an hour every single day, and it was in the afternoon. And so I was never at the Airbnb when there was power. So essentially it was that there was no power at all times. And of course, I was there for a week. So I dealt with this for a week, brought portable batteries, it was fine. Like I got through it because again, like I was only there for a week, but because I was staying in that neighborhood and walking around, just seeing what this means for the people, the Cuban people, on a day-to-day basis was really impactful. This means that, thinking about elderly people trying to go to sleep, needing medicine, needing cool water, needing basically anything, uh extra to be able to make it through the night and be comfortable, they don't have that. They can't turn on a fan, they can't do anything. Babies, for example, if you think about a newborn and every single thing you have to do to protect newborns and make sure, they're not getting too hot, that they are not getting bitten by mosquitoes. Right now in August, it's one of the hottest months in Cuba. It was, around 35 degrees to 40 degrees Celsius. For our US listeners, that's about 90 to 100 degrees, even at night. So if you can just imagine the heat that you feel at night, no fan, no AC, lots of mosquitoes. Um, there's, an increase in cases of dengue, of chikungunya. These are mosquito-borne illnesses. This is extremely difficult. So children, babies, they have to deal with these really hot temperatures. They have to deal with mosquitoes. And then of course, the health system. We visited a cancer institute, and that's some of the footage that you saw there on the screen. A cancer institute where there's, a child oncology ward. These institutes, thankfully, because the Cuban government has central planning, um, these institutes in many cases are able to, for example, maintain power because they have generators, and the Cuban people and their government are so conscious and invested in the fact that they need to maintain some level of a health system, that they make sure that all of the major hospitals do have fuel. But just because they have fuel does not mean they have medicine. And so in many of these centers and many of the hospitals, they have run out of essential treatments that they need. And one very concerning development that basically took place at the end of May is that the one of the executive orders and one of the sanctions, sorry, that were passed by the U.S. government is that was targeting shipping companies. And so, since the beginning of June, many major shipping companies have refused to stop in Cuba because they're afraid they're going to face, these secondary sanctions by the U.S. government. And so, there are 70,000 shipping containers all across the Caribbean full of goods that the Cuban government has purchased. So imagine a government that's being strangled, a government that, an island that is being kept in the dark, but is still allocating resources to buy food, medicine, essential supplies. They can't even get those supplies because the shipping companies are too afraid to sail. And so there have been essentially what's getting to the island is on planes, it's through donations, but things that they have bought are not getting to the island. And so this means that, going to the cancer hospital and speaking to doctors with tears in their eyes because they can't give chemotherapy, life saving radiation to thousands of patients, to children who have cancer. They can't receive the care that they need to survive. And so, again, I'm saying this now we've said it before on the show, it was different seeing it in person because you see these doctors who are literally walking to work, biking to work in this heat, knowing that when they get home, they have no water, they have no electricity, they have no AC. They get to work and they deal with this, facing the families of young cancer patients and saying, "We don't have the treatment for you." And so, speaking to them, hearing these stories was really devastating. And again, I think this point is so important. The US is able to maintain this criminal policy through blackmail, through threats, and through, this kind of over compliance of the international community. The Mexican government is one of the only governments in the entire world, besides obviously Russia and March, which has been brave enough to say, we are going to sail anyways. And I think this week another ship is sailing from Mexico with essential goods. But essentially, this blockade works because everyone is terrified of the United States because
Mhm.
it's a big bully, because it controls the international financial system, and because people need the US as a trading partner. But in essence, if the UK, if France, if they wanted to, they could send ships with all of these goods, with all of this, they could literally just send the things that the Cuban people, that the Cuban businesses, that the Cuban government has bought, and radically change the conditions for people on the ground. And so I think that's one of the most heartbreaking things is knowing that what they need has been bought, has been paid for, it is there, but they simply have just been under a medieval siege by the US government that is just so bloodthirsty. It's not enough for there to be a genocide in Gaza. It's not enough for the people to see that it can just bomb Iran whenever it wants. It has to also strangle this island nation of just over 10 million people, because it is brave enough to say that we demand our sovereignty be respected. And so it was devastating, but again, it's always inspiring because the Cuban people will say they'll never cede their sovereignty. And if the conditions to end this blockade are allowing the US to make it a casino and a mafia hotspot for the United States, then they don't want that. And they will defend their sovereignty and they will defend their people, until the last consequences. So it was inspiring, it was devastating, but I think right now is the time to continue putting pressure on again, on the United States government, but also on governments of the world that have to just stand up to this US bullying because the only way the US is able to continue with all of these policies across the world is because these governments are just too afraid to do anything about it. So there's my report from Cuba, Rania.
Well, no, I really appreciate that. And it's important to understand what the material reality on the ground looks like. And it's just hearing you talk about all that, my mind goes back to the report the State Department released under Marco Rubio a few weeks ago, claiming that Cuba wants to conquer the US. Um, like every accusation is a confession,
No,
because
yeah.
that's exactly what this current government in the US is trying to do to Cuba in the most cruel and disgusting and demonic way possible.